This is the document they said would never exist. A single sheet of paper bearing 40 national seals signed an emergency session in Geneva, Switzerland at 6:47 a.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, March 11th, 2026. Not a treaty, not a communique, an emergency declaration with teeth. 40 nations representing over 62% of global trade volume and 58% of combined world GDP have just formally declared that the United States of America has become, in the language of the document itself, an unreliable partner in the multilateral order. Read that again. 40 nations, 6 words, unreliable partner. Those 2 words have never appeared in formal international diplomatic language directed at America. Not during Vietnam, not during the Iraq War, not during any financial crisis in modern history until today. As of this morning, the United States of America has been officially, formally, and irreversibly declared isolated on the world stage by the largest coordinated diplomatic action since the founding of NATO. Buckle up, because what we are about to walk you through is not commentary. This is not opinion. This is the documented collapse of 79 years of American-led world order happening right now in real time while you are watching this video. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly what this declaration says and what it means for your savings, your security, and your children's future. We are going to identify the 40 nations who signed it and explain why their participation signals something beyond politics. We are going to explain the legal and economic mechanisms that this declaration triggers automatically. And we are going to answer the one question every American over the age of 50 has to be asking right now. Can the United States survive being frozen out of the global system it built? The short answer is not without severe pain. The longer answer is what the next 20 minutes are going to be about. Stay with us. The most explosive part of this story is coming in just a few minutes. And once you hear it, you will not be able to unhear it. To understand why 40 nations moved with such speed and coordination this morning, you have to understand the chain of events that made this declaration not just possible, but inevitable. The fuse was lit in January. The powder keg had been building for years. Start with the tariff spiral. In January of 2026, the United States unilaterally imposed emergency tariffs averaging 34% on imports from the European Union, 41% on Canadian goods, and a staggering 67% on imports from the ASEAN trading bloc. The administration framed it as economic patriotism, protecting American workers from decades of unfair trade. And for the domestic base, that message landed. But in the foreign ministries of Berlin, Tokyo, Ottawa, and Seoul, something else was happening. Diplomats who had spent entire careers maintaining the post-World War II trading architecture began drafting what one senior EU official, speaking to the Financial Times on Background last week, described simply as the exit document. Then came the NATO payment ultimatum. On February 3rd, the White House sent a formal diplomatic cable to all 29 remaining NATO member states. Not an informal note, not a press statement, a diplomatic cable with response-required language, demanding that each member nation increase defense spending to 5% of GDP within 18 months or face the suspension of Article 5 security guarantees. Article 5 is the bedrock of NATO. It is the sacred promise. An attack on one is an attack on all. The United States had just conditionally threatened to rip it apart. 3 NATO members announced emergency cabinet sessions within 48 hours. 4 called their ambassadors home for consultations. Germany's chancellor called it, in a speech to the Bundestag that was watched by 47 million people in Europe, the end of the alliance as our grandfathers built it. And here's where it really gets serious. While the tariff war and the NATO crisis were consuming the foreign policy bandwidth of the State Department, something was happening in the background that almost no one in the American media was tracking. The dollar reserve system was coming under coordinated, quiet, methodical attack. In February, China and Saudi Arabia concluded a bilateral energy agreement denominated entirely in yuan, not as a test, not as a pilot program, as permanent policy. Brazil and Argentina announced that all bilateral trade, representing $47 billion annually, would henceforth be settled in local currencies through a new clearing mechanism that bypassed the SWIFT system entirely. India quietly expanded its rupee-denominated trade corridors with Russia, Iran, and 12 African nations. Individually, each of these moves could be dismissed as posturing. Together, they represent something the U.S. Treasury Department's own internal assessment, leaked to the Wall Street Journal on March 4th, described as a structural erosion of dollar hegemony at a pace not seen since the collapse of Bretton Woods. The stage was set. The actors were in position. All that was needed was a trigger. The trigger came on March 9th when the United States withdrew without notice from emergency climate talks in Nairobi, talks that had been scheduled for 2 years, that 36 nations had sent foreign ministers to attend, and that were expected to produce the binding emissions framework that the insurance industry, the agricultural sector, and dozens of emerging economies had been depending on. The United States chair sat empty. An American flag sat at an empty table. The image went around the world in minutes. By that evening, according to sources in the Swiss Foreign Ministry, phone calls began circulating among the foreign ministers of the European Union, the G20 bloc, and the ASEAN group. Not angry calls, calm ones, businesslike. The kind of calls that happen when people who have been planning for something finally decide the time has come. Don't go anywhere. Because what those calls produced, what was signed this morning in Geneva, is something that has mechanisms built into it that the American public has not been told about. And those mechanisms are ticking right now. Let's get precise about what this declaration actually does, because the coverage you will see on mainstream media will focus on the optics, the ceremony, the speeches, the symbolism. We need to talk about the architecture. The Geneva Declaration of Multilateral Autonomy, as it has been formally titled, operates on 3 tracks simultaneously. Track 1 is the Trade Realignment Protocol. Signatories have committed to establishing what the document calls tariff reciprocity corridors among themselves, meaning they will preferentially reduce trade barriers for each other while collectively maintaining elevated barriers against non-signatories. The United States is a non-signatory. This means that 40 nations, representing, again, 62% of world trade volume, are now building a preferential trading architecture explicitly designed to route around the American economy, not to punish it, to replace it. There's a difference. Punishment implies you want the other party to change behavior. Replacement means you've decided the relationship isn't worth saving. Track 2 is the financial clearance mechanism. This is the part that should make every American with a mortgage, a pension, or a 401k sit up straight. The declaration includes a commitment to develop and implement within 18 months a non-dollar clearing system for bilateral and multilateral trade settlement among the signatories. They are not abandoning the dollar overnight. They are building the infrastructure to do so methodically, the pipes, the switches, the protocols, so that when the time comes, the transition can happen quickly. The head of the Bank for International Settlements confirmed in a statement this morning that the BIS has been providing technical consultation to the working group developing this system since November of last year. Since November, this was being built in secret for 4 months while American officials were tweeting about trade deficits. Track 3. And this is the one that has constitutional scholars in Washington reaching for their casebooks this morning, is the Security Coordination Protocol. 12 of the 40 signatories are current NATO members. Under the declaration, they have committed to establishing a parallel security consultation framework, operating independently of NATO command structures for coordinating responses to regional threats. They are not leaving NATO. That would require formal withdrawal proceedings. They are building a second structure inside the existing one, a shadow alliance that can function without American participation or approval. Senator James Risch of Idaho, ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, told reporters at 9 a.m. this morning that he had not been briefed. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs was reportedly not consulted. The Secretary of State was, according to 3 sources cited in the Washington Post's breaking coverage, informed of the declaration's finalization via a routine diplomatic cable, not a phone call, not an emergency briefing, a cable. They didn't even extend the courtesy of a phone call. This is the signal. This is what diplomats call a communication of finality. When you stop calling and start sending cables, it means the relationship has moved from partnership to management. America is not being expelled from the world order it created. It is being managed, contained, worked around. And here's what nobody in the American media is asking yet. What does the Constitution say about this? What are the checks and balances that are supposed to prevent a single administration from dismantling 79 years of alliance architecture without congressional authorization? Here is where the constitutional stakes become impossible to ignore, and this is the part that matters most to anyone in this audience who has spent their life believing in the American system, in the separation of powers, in the idea that no single person gets to make decisions this large alone. Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress, not the President, the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. The tariffs that triggered this crisis were imposed via executive order using emergency economic powers under a 1977 statute called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. IEPA was designed for sanctions against hostile foreign governments, Iran, North Korea, rogue states. It was never intended to be used to impose permanent tariff structures on America's closest allies. Senator Maria Cantwell of Washington filed suit in the Court of International Trade on February 28th, arguing exactly this point. The administration filed to dismiss. The court ruled on March 7th, 4 days ago, that the case has standing and will proceed to full hearing. That ruling was buried under other news, but it matters. Because if IEPA-US is ultimately ruled unconstitutional, every tariff imposed under it since January becomes legally void. The entire trade architecture of the past 6 months unwinds. Except by then, 40 nations will have already built their replacement system. The damage will be done even if the legal instrument is struck down. Meanwhile, the NATO cable, the conditional threat to Article 5 guarantees, was sent from the White House without Senate consultation. The Senate has treaty-making authority. The NATO alliance is a treaty obligation. 3 former secretaries of state, including 2 Republicans, have now signed an open letter published this morning in The Atlantic, arguing that the February 3rd cable constituted an unauthorized modification of treaty obligations and may itself be subject to legal challenge. The letter calls it an act of unilateral executive overreach with no modern precedent in American foreign policy. That letter has 847 signatures as of this morning, including 14 retired ambassadors and 2 former national security advisors. And here's where it really gets serious. The 20 nations who signed the declaration that are also signatories to American bilateral investment treaties, the legal agreements that protect U.S. businesses operating overseas, have now, by joining the Geneva Declaration, potentially created grounds for those investment treaties to be renegotiated or suspended. American companies, Boeing, Caterpillar, Chevron, dozens of agricultural exporters, depend on those investment treaty protections for the billions of dollars they have in overseas facilities. Legal analysts at the Council on Foreign Relations put out an emergency brief at 7 a.m. this morning, estimating that American corporate exposure in the signatory nations totals approximately $2.3 trillion in fixed overseas assets. $2.3 trillion in American corporate investment is now operating in a changed legal environment, and the boards of those companies are finding out about it the same way you are. Right now, this morning. Don't go anywhere. Because the worst part, the part that connects all of this to your kitchen table, your retirement account, your grocery bill, is coming next. Let's talk about what the dollar actually does for ordinary Americans, because this is where the abstract becomes personal. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency is not just a matter of national pride. It is the structural subsidy that allows the United States to run permanent trade deficits, finance its national debt at lower interest rates than any other country on earth, and maintain a standard of living that its domestic productivity alone could not sustain. When other countries need to buy oil, they buy dollars first. When international banks settle transactions, they settle in dollars. When emerging market governments build foreign exchange reserves, they hold American treasury bonds. This is the exorbitant privilege, as the French economist Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called it in 1965, and it has been the silent underwriter of the American way of life for 8 decades. The Geneva Declaration's Track 2 financial mechanism and the non-dollar clearing system is a direct structural attack on that privilege, not a sudden attack, a slow, methodical, deliberate erosion. The analogy is not a punch to the jaw. It is water finding its way through a crack in a dam. Patient, inevitable. Once the infrastructure is built, the incentive to use it grows with every American tariff, every broken alliance promise, every withdrawn chair at an international table. The Congressional Budget Office issued a confidential assessment in January, later obtained and published by Reuters, estimating that a 15% reduction in dollar reserve demand over a 10-year period would result in U.S. borrowing costs increasing by between 0.8 and 1.4 percentage points. That sounds small. It isn't. A 1% increase in the rate at which the U.S. government borrows money adds approximately $330 billion per year to the national debt service. That is money that cannot go to Social Security, cannot go to Medicare, cannot go to veterans' benefits. It is money extracted silently from every American household through higher prices, higher taxes, or both. This is the mechanism by which geopolitical decisions made in Geneva this morning will arrive at your kitchen table within 18 months. This is how foreign policy becomes grocery policy. This is why the people in this audience, people who have worked their entire lives, built their retirement savings, paid their taxes, followed the rules, need to understand what happened this morning in ways that go far beyond the television commentary. What does Vladimir Putin think when he sees this declaration? He thinks he has just watched the United States do in 6 months what 30 years of Russian strategic planning could not accomplish: voluntarily alienate its own alliance structure. What does Xi Jinping see? He sees the Belt and Road Initiative suddenly gaining 32 new potential partners who have just publicly announced their desire to build trade infrastructure that bypasses Washington. What does the Prime Minister of Japan see? Japan is one of the 40 signatories. Japan, the cornerstone of American security architecture in the Pacific for 70 years, the nation that hosts 55,000 American troops. Japan signed this declaration. That sentence should be read slowly and understood fully. Japan signed this declaration, not because Japan is an adversary, because Japan's government, after exhausting every diplomatic channel, made the calculation that the risk of depending entirely on American security commitments had become unacceptably high. Now let's push the scenario to where it leads, because this audience deserves to understand the full trajectory, not just today's headline. There are 3 possible paths forward from this morning, and every single one of them involves significant pain for the American people. Path 1, the administration reverses course, suspends the tariffs, reaffirms Article 5, returns to the climate talks. In this scenario, the declaration signatories would likely pause their financial clearance timeline. The shadow alliance coordination would slow. The dollar erosion would decelerate. Some of the damage could be repaired over 5 to 7 years. But here is the brutal reality of Path 1. Credibility, once spent, does not refill quickly. Allies who have spent 6 months publicly organizing an exit from American leadership will not simply reverse course because a speech was delivered. The infrastructure they are building will keep being built because they have learned, painfully, that they cannot afford not to build it. Path 2, the administration escalates, responds to the declaration with additional tariffs, diplomatic expulsions, or threats to withdraw from international institutions. In this scenario, the 18-month timeline for the financial clearance system compresses dramatically. Nations that were hesitating on the margins of the declaration sign on quickly. The dollar loses reserve demand faster than any model has projected. American borrowing costs spike. The Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice between defending the dollar and supporting domestic economic growth. This is the scenario that former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers described last month, before this declaration existed, as the financial equivalent of lighting the house on fire to prove you own it. Path 3, and this is the one that constitutional scholars are most focused on this morning: Congress acts, uses its Article 1 authority to reclaim the tariff-setting power that the executive branch has been exercising unilaterally, files suits, holds hearings, passes legislation reinstating the traditional trade consultation process. This is the constitutional remedy. This is what the founders built the separation of powers to make possible. And here is the honest assessment. It has never been harder to make it work than it is right now. But it is the path that preserves the American system. The path that says the rule of law is more durable than any single administration's decisions. The path that says 79 years of alliance architecture can be repaired because it was built on shared values, not personal relationships. The founders understood this moment, not this specific moment. They could not have imagined the World Trade Organization or NATO Article 5, but they understood the danger of concentrated executive power in foreign affairs. They understood that a republic could not survive if a single individual could unilaterally rewrite its relationships with the world. That is why they gave Congress the power over commerce, the power to ratify treaties, the power of the purse. Those powers exist precisely for this morning. The question is whether the people holding them have the will to use them. So, as we close out this analysis, here is what to watch for in the next 72 hours. Watch for the administration's formal response to the declaration, not the social media response, the formal diplomatic response. The language will tell you everything about which of the 3 paths is being chosen. Watch for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee's emergency session, which has been called for Thursday morning. Watch for the bond markets when they open in London at 3 a.m. Eastern. Because if foreign holders of American Treasury debt begin reducing positions in response to this declaration, you will see it in the yield curve before you see it anywhere else. Watch for whether Japan, in particular, issues any clarifying statement. Japan's presence on this declaration is the pivot point. If Japan begins quietly signaling that it wants an off-ramp, there may be room for negotiation. If Japan doubles down, the architecture is locked. Watch your grocery prices in the next 90 days. Watch your mortgage rate if it comes up for renewal. Watch the trade deficit numbers for February, which will be released on April 3rd. Those numbers will be the first hard data showing whether the tariff spiral has actually reduced the deficit or whether it has simply increased prices for American consumers while triggering the alliance collapse that is making the long-term dollar picture darker by the day. This is not the end of America. Nothing that happened this morning is irreversible. Yet. But the window to reverse it is narrower than it was yesterday, and it will be narrower tomorrow than it is today. Every day that passes without a change in course is another day of infrastructure being built in Geneva, in Shanghai, in Riyadh, in Tokyo. Infrastructure designed to root the global economy around the United States. And infrastructure, once built, develops constituencies. People whose jobs depend on it. Governments whose stability rests on it. Financial systems whose architecture assumes it. That is how the dollar's quiet erosion becomes permanent. Not with a bang. With 40 signatures on a single sheet of paper at 6:47 in the morning, while America was still asleep. For the first time in the living memory of every person watching this video, America woke up officially isolated. The question now is what we do next, because the answer to that question will define what kind of country our children inherit. This is the stress test of the American Republic. The history books are being written this week. Subscribe. Stay with us. The next chapter comes fast.